Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. Coming to you from the Long Valley Studio in Washington, Utah, I'm your host, Dave Markel. This is episode 162. Today's episode is one that I will forever hold near and dear to my heart because it's an episode with one of my favorite people in the whole world. A person who's not only a mentor to me, he is a close friend. He's the reason I became interested in what it means to be trauma-informed, and he's why I'm so intrigued and interested in the neuroscience of trauma and memory. I am thrilled today to host Dr. David Lisak. It is far beyond an honor and privilege to have him on this show. Rather, it's an achievement for this production. I could easily make David's intro an hour-long tribute to his work and life accomplishments. Instead, I'll give you as much info on him as I can in the episode notes. For now, let's get into the conversation. Here's David. Hey, SAS listeners, I am so thrilled and honored to have with me today Dr. David Lisak. He's a mentor, he's a great friend, and I'm more than pleased and pleasured to introduce him to you. David Lisak, welcome to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories. Thanks for doing this.
It's my pleasure and my honor, Dave. It's great to see you and great to hear your voice. And I look forward to having a good conversation with you.
Thank you. Man, this is big for me. It's something I've been wanting since I started this podcast. For the sake of my audience, I'll let you know David's been through some severe health issues, and it's just taken a while for him and I to coordinate. We have kept in touch somewhat, but when he agreed to do this as an episode, I was just elated. Like you said, I'm really looking forward to this episode and talking about some really important things. David, tell my audience, if you don't mind, some of your history, your background, your education, your training, your teaching, all the things that you've done and what you're up to now, if you don't mind.
Rather than starting with professional, did this, did that, I'm 71 years old. So at this stage of life, thankfully, we have a little bit more of a perspective on our own lives. So I'm going to start with my family history, because it actually had a very important impact on my professional life, the choices I made. But I'll keep it condensed. I'm Jewish. Both sides of my family were affected by the Holocaust. My mother's family, most people survived, but my mother was living in Vienna when the Nazis took over, was desperately trying to get out. She was engaged to be married, actually, to Viktor Frankl. My mother finally got a visa to get out. Actually, you needed 3 visas. You needed to have a visa from a country that's allowing you to come in. So Canada gave her that. Then you had to get a visa from the British because you have to go through Britain to get on the boat to go to Canada. And then you take those 2 visas and you bring them to the Gestapo. And the Gestapo had to give you an exit visa. She finally got all 3 visas and raced to the train station because you don't wait. You literally go to the train station. And she called Victor and they met at the train station and they had all kinds of ideas and schemes to get him a visa, but they hadn't gotten it yet. And so they said goodbye on the train station, thinking that they were going to be reunited in New York in a couple months. And they never saw each other again for 14 years later.
Wow.
And then my father's side, almost every one of the person were killed in the Holocaust. So I grew up surrounded by this. Their relatives, friends with tattoos on their arms. And my mother was deeply, deeply traumatized. And I absorbed it. There was no way not to. I had nightmares about the Gestapo pounding up the stairs and pounding on the door and all that kind of stuff. And then I always think of my life being absolutely shaped by the Second World War. So the other thing that happened that was related to the Second World War is that when I was 5 years old, my father had died when I was 10 months old. So my mother was raising 2 young kids. And when I was 5, she brought a boarder in for 2 reasons. One, to get some income. And second, because she went off to teacher's college so that she could get a certificate to become a teacher and have a solid income. My brother was 2 years older, so he was in school all day, but I was in school only for the morning. So she needed somebody to take care of me in the afternoon. And so this boarder was going to do that. He was a Dutch citizen. His family was in what is now Indonesia, was the Dutch East Indies. And when the Japanese invaded, they put all the Dutch citizens, and there were a lot of them, in concentration camps, and they separated the men from the women and children. And the camps were horrendous. Yeah. They were nightmarish. And there was widespread sexual abuse and rape of the women and children. Well, he was a survivor of that camp. And for 3 months, when I was 5 years old, he did to me what had been done to him by the Japanese. Oh, man. And of course, as you and everybody who's listening to this podcast, I'm sure is familiar with how that kind of abuse stays with you and it shapes much of your life. So big surprise that I grew up and became a psychologist and focused entirely on trauma and on sexual abuse and sexual assault. So my professional life, I didn't start out. I actually was a dairy farmer. Didn't have my own farm, but I worked on farms as a herdsman for a number of years. And then I was a reporter in Montreal for a few years. In my late 20s, after my mental health started to get a little rocky, and I knew that there are a number of things that I had to reckon with. Now, the thing I thought I had to reckon with was the death of my brother. He died when I was 23, he was 25. What I didn't know is that I had been sexually abused when I was 5 years old. No idea.
Wow.
It was gone.
Yeah.
Completely gone from my consciousness. Now, there were plenty of, markers. I mean, if you had met me when I was in my late 20s, we had a good conversation. You'd probably walk away thinking, there's something there that he doesn't know about. And when I was in grad school, in my second year, this is at Duke, and Duke University, the psych department, and especially the clinical psych part of it, was just in this moment of transition. And I don't know who I should thank. I thank somebody that I was there just in time to receive the mentorship and education from the older school, from the men and women who were really the early clinical psychologists. And my most important mentor there, Irving Alexander, was a World War II veteran. He flew B-17s over Germany, 35 trips, survived. And it was that generation and their understanding of psychology, both the practice and the way of gathering information and gathering knowledge about psychology, was so much more of a humanistic approach. They were not in thrall of statistics and let's make our discipline as hardcore as all the other disciplines. It has to be a science, and we can't do all that soft, mushy stuff. And no, but they were scientists, and Irving was as much a scientist as anybody else. And he just had a brilliant mind, and he had devised a systematic way of listening, observing somebody, and looking for data and looking for the patterns in the data. And it's every bit as much science as anything else.
Absolutely. Yeah.
In a lot of ways, it's harder. You can't just add up ones and twos, and it's hard.
A lot more than just checkbox. And
yes,
deeply rooted in the science of the mind and what's going on. Just from listening to you, I'm guessing you could say he was trauma-informed before anybody knew what the words trauma-informed meant.
Oh, of course. And he had, I don't think that term was around yet.
No.
But, I mean, he would immediately understand what you're talking about because that's how he was. I remember he interviewed me. In clinical psych, you make the application, and if you get an invitation to be interviewed, you're in the final cut, right? And so I had a series of interviews, which were pretty, what you would expect. And then I walk into Irving's office, and he just stares at me for a while. And he says, there's something in one of your letters of recommendation that I want to read to you. And he reads this one line from, actually, she was a very, very famous, it was Mary Ainsworth and John Bowlby who put together attachment theory. And Bowlby was the theoretician and Ainsworth was the researcher who really nailed it down. But anyway, so I worked with her, and so she gave me a letter of recommendation. And the sentence that he reads to me is, David is unintrusive, comma, sometimes to a fault. And he reads it, and he looks at me, and he says, what do you make of that? And of course, what was he testing? Sure, he wanted to see if I understood what Mary was getting at. Would I be confident enough that I could talk about something that could be a fault? And what an incredible way of tapping into somebody and seeing what comes out. And I was just enthralled. I mean, it was this most interesting moment of a day of otherwise completely normal, what you'd expect from those kinds of interviews. So anyway, Irving and I had incredible days together, just sort of talking about theories of the mind. I was enthralled with Jung, so was he. So that was grad school, and I started working on trauma and sexual assault while I was in grad school. And what I was primarily looking at in grad school was perpetrators and rapists. And that's where some of the earliest stuff I did came out of. When I got my first job after grad school at UMass Boston, I started doing research on male survivors of sexual abuse because there was so little. Mike Liu's book was out. That was almost it. And there's just very little research. It was almost like everybody knew that boys and girls get abused. And there are studies out there. There were then, and there still are, studies of sexual abused kids, both boys and girls. And back then, and frankly still today to some degree, those boys somehow just disappear. When you start looking at the research literature on men, adult men, who were sexually abused as kids, how are they doing? What kinds of things are they suffering from? How does it affect their development? How does it affect their educational status? And all those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. There was nothing. So I just started doing that kind of research. And then those things led to other things, of course, So I ended up doing a lot of training, as you have as well, of law enforcement, prosecutors, virtually everybody involved in the criminal justice system.
Right. May I ask, and are you able to talk about when it was that you made the realization that you had been sexually assaulted and what that impact was and how it influenced your path into your career?
Mm-hmm. Sure. It was a pretty dramatic So it was, I'm pretty sure it was second year. It could have been the third year of grad school. I was in therapy, and the clinical program wasn't a necessity, but they encouraged clinical students to get some therapy while they were in grad school. Mm-hmm. And one of the ways they made it possible, because of course we didn't have any money, they made arrangements with professionals who wanted the experience. And I lucked out. A very experienced woman who was a psychiatrist, many years of work, therapy work, decided she wanted to get certified as a psychoanalyst. And what you do is you go through a lot of coursework and stuff, but then you have to do supervised psychoanalytic treatments. And so I was willing to do 4 days a week for X number of years, and I paid $5 per session.
Wow.
So I started, and I think it was early in the second year. So now, the day before this, if you had asked me, David, were you sexually abused as a child? I would have looked at you like, what? No, of course not. With absolute certainty, absolute certainty. That night, during the night, I had a dream. It wasn't a nightmare. It was a disturbing dream. I don't remember, I have it written down, but I don't remember the details of it, except for the end. I realized that there was a child, there was a little girl who was in trouble. I knew she was in trouble, and she was young, and she shouldn't have been out on the streets the way she was. And so I tried to keep up with her. I didn't want her to get out of my sight because I was afraid for her. Mm. And I follow her and follow her and follow her, and she comes to this little kind of a shopping center, except it wasn't stores, it was offices. And she walks in to one of the offices, and then I discover that she's in a closet. And I open the closet, and there she is standing there, and she's wearing this kind of helmet that children wear when they are at danger of hurting themselves. Mm-hmm. And I look at her, and something really overwhelms me, and I wake up. That's how I experienced it. I didn't know what, but something overwhelming just launched me out of sleep, out of the dream. So later that morning, I actually remember it was an 11 o'clock appointment. And I go in there and I sit down and I start telling her the dream with a lot of details. And I get to that point where I open the door and I start sobbing and writhing. I mean, literally, I collapsed. And I have no idea what, her name was Daphne, the psychiatrist. I can't imagine what she went through because I was drenched. I was, it sweated through my clothes. And when I finally was able to communicate with her, the first words I said was, "It was me." And it's not like all of a sudden I had all the memories of what happened to me. I had just fragments of just horror. And boy, my reality was just shattered. And it occurs to me now that I know I was there. These were 45-minute sessions, and I'm sure I was there for 2-3 hours. I don't know what she did. I don't know how she canceled her other appointments, but she wouldn't let me go, obviously. And that was the beginning. It's been years, and when was the last time I had another memory fragment? Last year. Wow. I mean, obviously, when these things happen or these memories come back, they don't have the same impact on me because I've stabilized a lot and so forth and learned to live as all of us survivors do. We learn to sort of live with the trauma. But there are fragments that come back to me. So that, of course, is what propelled me when I graduated, got my doctorate, and got a job as a professor at UMass. I remember I was pretty hesitant about starting to do research on this, on male survivors. And those doubts made me feel guilty because I was acutely aware of the fact that, well, for God's sakes, if, I have a doctorate now. I'm a professor at a university. I've been trained in research methods. I was trained by some of the best people to do qualitative research. If I don't, who would? So I just launched into it. Of course, I'm really, really glad that I did. And it also it forced me fairly quickly to become open publicly about my own history. And in the trauma world, especially the research trauma world, like back when, in the early years of the modern era of trauma research, which really started in the 1980s as the Vietnam veterans had come back, and it was clear that they weren't all suffering from neuroses and whatever. I mean, it was something about the trauma. And at the same time, of course, there was a sort of a rising tide of research in the era of sexual assault, basically exclusively women at that point, but at least sexual assault was becoming part of public consciousness. But in the professional organizations like the Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, There were Vietnam veterans who had come back, gotten their degrees, and become researchers and clinicians. And they were open about their own PTSD experiences. But for them, the fact that they were Vietnam veterans made them more credible because they were there and now they're studying it. And if you are open about having a history of sexual trauma and you're a researcher, then all of a sudden it's the reverse. You're too close. You can't be impartial. You can't be.
You aren't healed.
Yeah, I mean, it was such a naked what? So the combat veterans, they're more credible, but the sexual trauma veterans, they're less credible. I mean, and actually, at some point, it just got to the point where I think, look, I'm not going to participate in that. I'm not going to what? I'm not going to be silenced by it.
Yeah.
And it was very liberating, frankly, to be open about it. It's a big part of my life. It shaped me. I'd rather it be out there.
And you went to the heart of researching offender mentality and what drives that. And it's fascinating to me. I have so many questions, but that particular issue makes me wonder what pushed you then into the mindset instead of the trauma impact on victims and survivors, the driving force of a perpetrator's, their offense.
Well, the first research I started doing at Duke was on rapists. And I did do some quantitative research on it, but the heart of the research I did was I interviewed these guys who there was so little awareness of non-stranger rape at that point that it was not difficult to find guys who had committed these crimes. They didn't see it as crimes, and most people didn't see it either.
Yeah.
So they were, so long as I didn't use the word rape, they were happy to talk to me about things that they had done.
It was more along the lines of sexual conquest, right?
Yes, it was. Yeah, it's like anything else. Power and anger are by far the more. It's not like they were starved for sex, and so this was the only way they can. It's nothing to do with that.
Right.
It was conquest. It was entitlement, power mainly. It's how they defined themselves as males. What were they going to tell their buddies the next day? And yeah, I was more interested. I wasn't trying to count the number of checks they wrote down on a test of some kind. I wanted to know how they thought and, of course, what their backgrounds were. But another major impetus for diving deeply into the psychology of perpetration was I started working on death penalty cases way back. I think my first case was in 1991. And boy, I've worked on about 300 cases at this point, and I've delved deeply into the lives of these men who, the simplest way of putting it is brutalization can lead to brutality. It doesn't necessarily. In fact, most of the time it doesn't. But with the right or the wrong, if you want to call it, ingredients, it can lead to really terrifying brutality. And so I've seen this over and over and over and over again in these death penalty cases. And it was a real opportunity, every one of those cases, an opportunity to understand how the brutalization of a child can lead to really terrible acts of violence. And the short answer is brutality plus abject neglect plus substance abuse equals brutality. And the most surprising thing, frankly, of the work I've done on death penalty cases is the fact that a lot of the cases I work on are post-conviction. So these guys are on death row. They've been on death row. When I meet with them, usually it's 10, 15, 20, 30 years after the crime. And what I've seen over and over again is even in the context of living in a cell by yourself for 23 hours a day, 7 days a week, and those cells are like 10 by 8, many of these men are unrecognizable. Like, I go through all the police reports, the crime scene photographs, the more modern cases, their crime scene videos, and I get nightmares from them. I go through all of that, and I go through investigation of his childhood. I interview him. I interview other witnesses and family members and so forth. And then I meet the guy, and he's unrecognizable. He's now a human being. One of the things that when people, and I say that to people, I said, how could they mature, develop a conscience, develop self-awareness in a cell by themselves? And I said, well, let's start with this. Those cells, they're locked, obviously. They can't just come and go. And of course, most people's reaction to that is, well, yeah, that's the horror of it. You're locked in this tiny little cell. Mm-hmm. And I said, but they can't get out, but nobody can get in. And especially at night, they can lie down on their little slab and nobody can come into their cell. And they sleep and they think and they meditate and they reflect on their lives alone in their cell in the quiet where nobody can come and harm them. They find peace. They find a stillness inside themselves. I just read one of these most recent cases. A guy wrote down, it was just like a diary entry, a one-page diary entry. And at the end of this thing, he says, the state wants to kill me, but they can't kill the guy who committed the crime. I executed him many, many years ago.
Wow.
Wow. I never thought he expressed exactly what I, over the last 30 years, have seen over and over and over again, is they're not there anymore. And it's hard for people to take in, I know, because it's not like I don't ignore what they did. I can feel the pain, not just of the direct victims who were killed, but the family members who have lived with the horrific loss of a family member. And yet somehow I have to reckon with what I see in front of me, that these men change. And the person who did these horrific crimes really has changed so fundamentally that it's hard to say that that person who did it is still there. So anyway.
It's like they've killed the killer, is what you've said from that page. Yes. That you read.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's fascinating. Mm-hmm. It's intriguing, but it's also extremely compelling in terms of how we think of offenders. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
To kill someone is to inflict trauma on yourself, I would think, because of the torture that they're putting themselves through that process of thinking and meditating and dwelling and being trapped in that cell. The cell isn't so much the punishment as the mind itself.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a guy, I won't even say what state he's in. He's still in the row. I did an evaluation of him, and his history of sexual abuse was so horrific that it was one of the most difficult cases for me ever. It was partly just the scope of the abuse that he suffered, but part of it was he had transformed himself into such a gentle man that you could see the pain in him as he answered my questions, and you could just see the suffering in him. But he contained it. And then when we got into his later life, typically I don't ask them about their crimes. First of all, I've got, thousands of pages of documents, and it's just not what they're asking me to do there. That, I'm there to find out what happened to them as kids and how it affected them. Mm-hmm. But he wanted to talk about the homicide. And the reason was that, he told me, he said, I'm not going to just tell you about what I suffered. I caused suffering, and now we're going to talk about that. It's like he wasn't going to, he had to balance the sheet. If his suffering gets to be described, then hers has to be on the table too, his victim. And so he, in brutal detail, described what happened. And he began to shake. And finally, it was just too much. And he slid off the chair onto the floor and started sobbing and sobbing and sobbing. And when I finally got him back in his chair, I wasn't sure, was he sobbing because of the pain and suffering of the woman he killed? Or was he sobbing because, again, of his own abuse? He looked at me and he said, I can never undo what I did to her, so I'll never be released from it. Now, I don't want to mislead people. This individual I've just been talking about is a very special individual, but many other men over the years, as you were saying, they can't get away from themselves and they can't get away from the things they've done. Some of them can't withstand it. They really become unhinged. But if you're forced, if you're in that cell alone for all those days and hours and weeks and years, at some point, many of these men reckon with themselves. And I think that's why there is that possibility of transformation.
A lot of your work then obviously deals with the empathic mindset of even entering into that cell or to the interview room where you're talking to these death row inmates and putting yourself in a place where you are capable of listening to this. Mm-hmm. And that's got to be impactful on you. Like you said, you've had nightmares about some of the things that you've seen, some of the things in the reports, the videos and things, but also what you've heard, I'm sure, has made an impact on you. David, can you tell us how you yourself developed coping mechanisms that get you through and enable you to interview the next guy and the next one and the next one? How do you deal with all of that?
Well, that's a work in progress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I wasn't all that good at it, meaning good at coping with it early on. It did trigger a lot of things in me.
Right.
Plenty of nightmares. There were plenty of times when I phoned my wife that night and needed some consolation, and sometimes just to ground me. Ongoing, almost like a joke with us now. Claire always wants me to call her when I get out of the prison. So I do. And says, so how are you feeling? How are you doing? In other words, how badly am I triggered?
Mm-hmm.
And for a long time, I'd say, no, I'm okay. I don't know why. It was pretty rough in there, but what do you have to tell me? But I'm doing okay. I'm doing okay. And then 3 hours later, I'm calling her. Well, and so what I realized, I dissociate. Wow, isn't that amazing?
Oh, where'd that come from?
Yeah. Oh, does it happen to me too?
Yeah, exactly. Wow.
So eventually I started realizing that, when she would ask me, I said, I have no idea. We'll find out later.
Yeah.
But I do, as I've aged, I have finally grasped what I can't tell you how many people, psychologists, social workers, psychiatrists, smart people have said, let it flow through you. Let the grief flow through you. Let whatever it is flow through you. Don't bottle it up. Don't try to categorize it. Let it flow.
Yeah.
And I think I somehow finally got it. And so if something really got to me, I didn't try to put it in a box, didn't try to hold it back. Does it make me angry? Okay, I'm going to get really angry here in the car. If it made me sad or just grief-stricken, then I cried. Mm-hmm. And, I want to be honest too here, balanced. There have been just a handful of cases where I've encountered men on death row who I just can't describe other than evil. Yeah, I'd get back in the car in the parking lot and I would have to admit, I wanted to kill that guy. Mm-hmm. I wanted to erase him from the earth. And that's true too.
Yeah. I mean, that's part of the human experience, right? Knowing all the spectrum that you must go through. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
David, if I could, with your permission, change the subject. I mean, it's still on the same topic, but I think you were one of the first mentors that I dealt with who helped me deeply understand the neuroscience of what it means to be trauma-informed. And I'm kind of putting you on the spot with this question, but can you tell my audience your definition of what it means to be truly trauma-informed?
Well, I don't know. I probably have an idiosyncratic definition of that. To me, and you'll recognize that this comes right out of the heart and soul of a survivor. My definition of trauma informed definition, maybe it's not a definition, it's a description of. To be trauma informed to me is being willing to go deeply into the horrific experience of the traumatized person and to go there with them. And when for example, when I'm one of these guys on death row, they may have mentioned what happened to them. Yeah, they'll give it a label, I was sexually abused or whatever. But they've never really told anybody about what it really was like. And I mean, at every level, what it did to them psychologically, what it did to them in terms of their sense of who they are, and also all the physical parts of it. Where did it hurt? Where does it still hurt? Where do you get phantom pains? What happened to you? What was done to you? When I'm assessing a guy interviewing a guy who was also physically abused, and we were talking about the physical abuse, I go through the array of when it happened and why and who had done it and what kinds of things did they hit you with, and were there welts, was there bleeding, did you ever broke a bone, and all those kinds of the medical side of it. Mm-hmm. But then I get to the part that's most important to me, and it anchored by this question. Let's say it was the father who did the beatings. Did you ever look into your father's face when he was beating you? What did his eyes look like? And let me tell you, that's when a tough guy with muscles bulging out of his thing, with tattoos all over his face and his body, just dissolves and starts sobbing. Because it's the fact that your father hated you, the fact that your father thought so little of you, thought you were just something to be beaten, was the most painful thing. That the bruises, the cuts, the welts, the broken bones, they all heal. But knowing that your father thinks of you that way, as a nothing, as a punching bag, that never goes away. Those are the things that children internalize, so that it's no longer out there, it lives inside them. And if you're wondering why somebody could, just throw away their lives on stupid things, stupid crimes, because that view of them has become the view of themselves. Trauma informed, to me, is you have to understand how a traumatized person lives 32nd by 32nd, and to be aware of that. And so to be trauma informed when you're in a room with somebody, it's a lot. You have to be able to, I guess it's almost like an extreme form of empathy. You have to see and feel through them.
Which is extremely difficult, because the natural response of the human experience is to avoid that. It's the psyche of the brain is to survive harm. So when you're actually hearing that harm, your brain wants to shut down. It goes into a dissociative state, like you said. It goes into this denial issue. Walls are built. And the problem is there are so many law enforcement personnel and detectives who can't hear that, yet they're the ones who are investigating these crimes, and they diminish the experience of the victim. I'm sorry, I'm getting really emotional. Mm-hmm. This is hard for me, because it's part of why I started this podcast, is to help criminal justice professionals learn that the most critical aspect of being an investigator is what you just said, is being empathic to victims and survivors of horrific crimes. And one of the most horrific crimes a human can experience is rape or sexual assault. And so how do you build up the capacity? How do you recognize in yourself? How do you teach other investigators that if you can't do that, if you can't be empathic and experience and listen to the most horrific parts of that crime that the victim or survivor has experienced, that maybe this work, maybe it's something you're not cut out for. Maybe you should find another line of work or a different aspect of law enforcement than rape and sex assault investigation. I know that's a very complicated, long, diluted kind of question, but
it's a really important dilemma that you're identifying. Look, you and I, how many detectives, investigators have we had in a room?
Right.
And if there are 50 detectives in that room, if there are 2 or 3 that you can see, they're getting this, at least, to some important degree, they're getting this. And then the other 47. So this is not very practical, but I think it's still important to say. So the work I do on death penalty cases, it's a mirror image of what detectives do. I'm working for the defense. Obviously, the prosecutors aren't very interested in me finding out that there's worse trauma. So I'm hired by defense counsel, but the lawyers, they don't go in there and interview the guy and try to get him to disclose and find out how it affected him. What do? They hire me to do it, and I come back and I give him a report. Here's what happened to him. Here's how it affected him. We don't do that on the prosecution side. Detectives don't hire me to go in and sit down with the victim of a crime and get a full account based on a deeply empathic connection with that person. And there's some real potential upsides to having somebody else go. And there are legal issues. I'm not talking about the legal issues that would make this impossible. But let's just take some man who actually reports that they were sexually assaulted. What are the odds that the man who was anally raped is actually going to disclose that? They'll disclose this happened and that happened and this happened. And then you push a little bit and maybe they'll add a little bit more. And you'll finish. Is there anything else? No, that was it. Because they are not going to tell you that they were also anally raped. That's actually an important thing. If you're I'm talking now from the prosecution side. That's a whole different thing that you're now charging this guy with. And that guy is now looking at major time in a penitentiary. But you won't know it unless somebody goes in with training, but it's also just the capacity to be that deeply connected and empathic with that victim to get them to the point of telling you the truth, the full truth of what happened to him. I don't know. I look, my wife is an attorney. I know I've had this conversation with her probably more than once over the years. If defense counsel can do it, why can't the prosecution side? Because you're right. There are some detectives who do have the emotional depth and capacity with some training to, first of all, do no harm, right, but actually do well for the victim and also well at getting important information from the victim. But they're a very small minority. In my experience, people who go in to become clinical psychologists like me are not the same as people who go into law enforcement. They're different personality types. Mm-hmm. And so to expect to find in a room full of 50 detectives, how many are you going to find who are personality-wise, they don't want to go there. And frankly, they probably can't. Yeah. That's not how they think. It's not how, and in all kinds of other ways, they can be absolutely excellent detectives.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Put them on a homicide case, but put them in a room with a vulnerable man or a woman who's just probably not the best place for them.
Yeah. And it lends to a culture in law enforcement and prosecution that really does a disservice to victims and survivors when it comes to investigating and prosecuting, because we all know that the prosecution, the successful prosecution rate where that rapist is convicted and does any time is less than 1%. But then we also are dealing with a mindset of prosecutors and judges who really have a hard time believing victims. So you've taught it, I've taught it, the group of people that we associate with know this, that there is this, for lack of a better term, rape culture that tends to victim blame or totally disbelieve victims. And it's huge all over social media now. It's huge with the Epstein files. It's huge in society's mindset when it comes to victims and survivors. Yet the dent that these victims and survivors are making in this issue is so minuscule. Why is it so hard to get past victim blaming and disbelieving victims? And where does that mindset come from that victims aren't truly victims? They're exaggerating or exacerbating a situation. I mean, it's mind-boggling to me. And I've got several theories, but I'd really like to hear your take and input on how we as a society push past and get over this mentality that victims make stuff up and victims asked for what they got.
Obviously, there are a number of factors that weigh in on this and create this, especially the sustainability of it.
Yeah.
I think one of the important ones, anyway, I don't want to rank order this, but one of the important ones is we're all afraid of what can happen to us. And so what we do is we set up all kinds of layers of denial. And I think fundamentally the scariest thing for probably most of us is that we can't control something. Like imagine, for example, that all of a sudden something blows up in outer space, a planet, unexpectedly, and it sends an enormous field of large and small, well, what are now whatever, comets or something, whatever you call them, right? Yeah. Asteroids.
Galactic debris.
Debris, bingo. But, sizable chunks. Mm-hmm. And they are moving at a fast rate. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, the scientists are saying, and the Earth is going to get hit. And our estimate is the Earth is going to get hit by at least 1,000 of these sizable pieces of debris. We have no way of predicting where and when they're going to hit.
And what that impact will be.
We can tell you that some of these are sizable things, so they're going to wipe out cities, mm-hmm. or at least big chunks of cities. Good luck. That is arguably one of the most horrific things that any of us could imagine. That don't know exactly when, don't know exactly where, don't know if I'm going to be alive next week or not. Nothing I can do about it. Can't put up an umbrella. Can't prepare for the wildfire. No point in having a go bag because you really ain't going to go anywhere. We don't do well with uncontrollable things. And so what we try to do is we use sort of psychological tricks. What would be easier than, oh, she got raped. Yeah, did you see the kind of skirt she wears? Or, she goes to these parties, probably out late at night, walks down the street by herself, I mean, we just come up with, oh, I wouldn't do that, and I wouldn't do that. And because I wouldn't do that, well, I'm not going to get raped. Look, I've seen it. We've all seen it in the most absurd things where we're talking about a child who was sexually abused by a priest or some teacher or something like that, or a Boy Scout. And this kid was 7 years old, and you'll still hear the same things. And of course, that drive to deny our uncontrollable vulnerability, it melds with other cultural things like women are sluts, women wear short skirts, then it's their fault that they've excited the boys or whatever. And then one other big factor, we have, 3,000 generations of gender beliefs. What's scarier, a female grizzly with cubs or a male grizzly? Who would you rather encounter? You can say neither, right? That's the easiest answer. But yeah. No, you have to choose. A female with cubs or a male grizzly?
Absolutely the male.
Exactly.
Because you can scare that guy off.
Right. And she is coming at you, man. Mm-hmm. Yeah. There you have it. Females can be pretty aggressive. And males, I don't know, maybe you have to be an old man to understand that we are absolutely as vulnerable as women. Oh, heck, we're all just grown up kids.
So, part of my theory, and I don't talk about this very much, but you've kind of hit the nail on the head. It goes back to some of the research that you've taught me, that our reaction, some of us having never been raped or sexually assaulted, looking at those who have and blaming them or not believing them, has a lot to do with inherited mindset for 3,000 years, however long, millennia of inherited mindset, just like the rats who have never been shocked or tortured, being put in a cage where that potential is there. They don't know that. They don't know that potential, but their great grandfather was shocked in a cage just like that, and their heart rate, the great grandchild's heart rate and blood pressure skyrockets. I just have this belief system, right or wrong, that rape culture persists because it's in our nature, it's in our mindset, it's in our DNA to disbelieve victims and survivors and to blame them as the cause of rape. I mean, there are cultures who still bury rape victims up to their necks and stone them because they were raped. Look what you've done to our family. Look what you've done to yourself. Look, and it's never the male. It's never the perpetrator. It's never the offender. I shouldn't say never. I'm using blanket statements, but it's rarely those people. And I wonder, are we doomed to always disbelieve and blame victims and survivors?
I hope not.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the one thing we could probably say with a fair amount of confidence and accuracy is that it's going to take generations. You and I now have gray hair. When I first met you, you didn't, and now you do. So at some point, you and I are going to leave the stage, and there are going to be new, younger men and women who are going to take up this cause, and they're going to get gray hair, and they're going to have this conversation, and they're going to say to each other, this is going to take generations. I think they're going to be right, and I think that their grandchildren will be right too. Look, you preface this by saying that these ingrained beliefs have been ingrained for millennia. So maybe we shouldn't be surprised that it's the pace of change, the pace of transformation is at a scale that would tell us that this is going to take generations.
Yeah.
Of course it will. It took that long for it to become this deeply ingrained. And, I think it's foolhardy to think that in one of our lifetimes, we're going to see momentous change.
Right.
My son is 31 years old, and I can see some of the people in his generation. Obviously, all those stereotypes, they're still there, but I also see young men and young women who, and it's not like they somehow got educated and they got an A in that course. It doesn't even, like, what? Why would people think that? Why would people think that way? And when I hear that, when I see that's kind of, I say, well, okay, so it can happen. People can grow up in an environment in which it never inculcates in them. And so obviously I'm talking about a very small segment of the generation, but like, if that can happen, then it can happen more.
That's true. And it makes me all the more appreciative and in admiration of you because of the push that, even though you're not necessarily maybe on that main stage anymore, you're still here pushing, talking about it, and advocating for massive change in the way we deal with victims and survivors on both sides of the spectrum of criminal justice and humane treatment. right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm gonna say something very, very selfish here, that I would really love to schedule some time with you again to have you back, because we barely scratched the surface of much of what I want to talk to you about and share with my audience your phenomenal capacity for understanding, and not only understanding, but articulating things in such a way that we learn. You have a special skill set that I've always admired and would love to expose my audience to more. So, will you at least consider possibly coming back for
Sure.
another episode? Thank you, David.
Yes, of
That
course.
means the world to me. And then, if you would just, upon concluding what we've talked about today, I generally ask my guests, what will you do when we hit the leave button from this Riverside studio meeting, seeing each other and talking? How will you then take care of yourself for the rest of today to deal with those implicit memories that suddenly become explicit, that suddenly come to your awareness? What will you do with the fatigue of sitting here for the last, what's it been, almost 2 hours? What will you do to take care of David?
Well, I truly think that the most effective way that I have found to handle the impact on me of whether it's having this kind of conversation with you, whether it's doing an evaluation, is self-awareness. We were joking earlier, I don't know if this was on the recording, but how I used to come out of prisons and just dissociate. And what I've over the years come to be able to do is to recognize when I'm in a dissociative state. And then I can work backwards. Yeah, you know what? You're not really here. And it's possible to recognize that in yourself. It just takes time and effort, I guess. And then when you realize, oh, okay, so why would I be? Oh, right. I was just in that prison for the last 6 hours, walking through the horrors of that guy's life. Yeah, that's what's going on. So what in particular is going on with me now? And sometimes I can't get much further than that. I just know that so many things that happened to him that also happened to me. Why am I surprised? And I just need to stop and breathe and come out of the dissociative state into an awareness of myself. And I find it easiest to do that through breathing, through meditation. I'll do that. I don't like doing it in the car when I'm still in the parking lot of the prison. So I usually, and most of these prisons are in rural areas.
Yeah.
So I drive a little ways, find a place to pull over, and I just sit in the car and start re-regulating my breathing. And that settles me. And oftentimes when I get settled, certain things come to me. I'm just open now. And so I remember certain particular things from the interview that I just did. And I said, I think that's what it was that really got to me. So I guess for me, the hardest part, and I want to make it clear that this conversation between you and me isn't the same, doesn't have the same impact on me as the kind of evaluation I'm talking about. You're a friendly face. You go way back with me. I feel totally safe here talking with you. So I'm not going to have to sit in my car and meditate to get over this.
Get over
quite the opposite. It's, I feel a little bit being a little unfair because, I'm 71 years old. I've been dealing with myself. Like, how old was I when I got the memories back? That was, I was maybe 30. So 41 years that I've been dealing with this. But this is important to note. Practice does make perfect. You spend a lot of time dealing with your reactions and your states of being, and you learn some things. And we're all different. So there's very limited usefulness for what I can say about this because everybody's different. And some people would think sitting in a car, oh my God, no, I got to get out, right? I got to, smell the grass. I got to get on a treadmill. I got to get on a bicycle. I got to run and just do whatever works that brings you back into that state that you feel, yeah, this is me. I'm back. I'm here. And from that state, first of all, just being back there That's 90% of it. But then in that state, you are much more likely to come to understand, okay, that's what got to me. And maybe you need to think a little bit about that, or write about it, or just talk to somebody about it. But get back.
I don't know how to sit here and think back on these last 2 hours and thank you enough. This has been phenomenal for me. Like I said, I've been looking forward to this for a long time, and I'm looking forward to doing it again. I know probably with some of the issues that you've been going through health-wise and everything else, that this is going to have an impact, and I truly appreciate the fact that you've, to me, made a sacrifice to be with me and spend the last 2 hours with me. So thank you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, and I do look forward to the possibility of doing this again, David. Thank you.
And David, it's been a pleasure. And I love the fact that, as you said, we could see each other and sort of engage in this conversation as both a conversation and just an active connection, which feels good.
Yeah, it does. I want to keep it up.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
And you take care of yourself.
I will, and you too. That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. What a conversation. I hope you felt what I felt throughout this episode, a deep sense of gratitude, humility, and awe for the work, the heart, and the humility that Dr. David Lisak brings into this world. You don't just stumble upon mentors like David. You don't get many people in life who steady your compass, lift your vision, and remind you why the work matters. And sharing this space and this mission with him has been profoundly meaningful for me. David, thank you for spending this time with us. And thank you for pouring your life into understanding trauma, into elevating survivors' voices, and into helping those of us in investigative and advocacy roles to do better, to be better. Your research, your mentorship, and your example have changed the field, and they've certainly changed and inspired me. I'm honored to call you a colleague, a mentor, and a friend, and I'm deeply grateful that SAS listeners got to learn of and learn from you today. Hey SAS listeners, thank you for being here. Thank you for caring. Thank you for refusing to look away, and thank you for being part of bringing justice to victims and survivors of rape or sexual assault just by being part of this conversation. It's as important as my other admonition, to start by believing. Again, you're helping bring justice to victims and survivors because we all know someone who's been impacted by rape or sexual assault. Please don't miss next week's episode. You'll find it just as fascinating and equally as important. We'll see you next week.